Welcome back to Beyond Four Walls. I'm David Dworkin, President and CEO of the National Housing Conference, America's oldest and broadest housing coalition. I'm joined today by Linda Mandolini, President of Eden Housing. Linda has led Eden since 2001, where she oversees affordable housing production, resident support services, and property management components of the organization with a staff of more than 500 employees. Under her leadership, Eden Housing has become one of the most productive and successful nonprofit affordable housing developers and owners in California and is nationally recognized for its work. To date, Eden has developed or acquired more than 11,000 affordable rental apartments in communities throughout California, completed 3 portfolio mergers and acquisitions, and has launched a number of initiatives to increase affordable housing preservation and to promote sustainable practices. Linda has received a number of awards, including being inducted into the Alameda County Women's Hall of Fame in 2017 and being named to the San Francisco Business Times Forever Influential Honor Roll in 2016. Linda is also a leader in housing policy on the local, state, and national level. He was one of the affordable housing leaders who worked tirelessly for the passage of California housing bonds that collectively generated $10 billion for housing. Linda is a graduate of Wheaton College in Massachusetts and earned an MBA at Boston University. Most important to me, however, is that Linda was a long-standing member of NHC's Board of Governors and our board chair during our historic revitalization. So thanks for joining us, Linda, and thank you as well for everything you do. I really appreciate you, and I appreciate you joining us.
Hey, David. Thanks for having me.
So let's jump into it. Tell me about Eden Housing, because you do so much, and your role in the California affordable housing ecosystem is really important.
Well, for those of you who don't know Eden, we are one of the oldest nonprofit affordable housing developers in the state of California. We actually got our start in 1968 through a group of volunteers, and they came together to work on a ballot initiative for fair housing. Our founding board chair was the coach at Cal State East Bay for their basketball team. And he had the first integrated basketball team in the Cal State system, and his players didn't have a place to live. So he formed Eden Housing to go to work on helping his players literally find an apartment to rent. And so the ballot initiative in California failed, but that didn't deter our board. They went on to adopt 6 families and build 6 houses, Habitat for Humanity style. And from there, they went on to do our first multifamily housing development in 1972 using HUD 236 programs, which is now a defunct program. But that property is one that we still own and manage, and It's still affordable. And the seniors who live there still call it home and is a great place to live. In fact, it's one of my favorite places to take people on a tour. Since then, obviously, we've grown, but part of our DNA has been not just to grow our portfolio, but to grow the pie for all of the folks who live in California. It's no mystery to anybody that California is one of the most expensive places in the country to live. And so one of our goals has always been to make sure that we're creating an ecosystem that supports building more housing. And so over the years, we've grown to 550 employees. We own just under 12,000 units of affordable housing, all multifamily here in the state. But we really have had a special focus and emphasis on, can people replicate what we can do? Because we know that in a state that is home to 39 million people, that Eden alone won't solve that problem. And so we don't just build the housing or buy the housing and preserve it. We also do resident services and property management. So we're full service and full circle in the work. And so we think a lot about how do we help our residents stay housed, help them advance economically, and how do we make sure that the housing we built in 72 is still standing today in 2023. And all of that, I'm making it sound really easy, but it is a lot of hard work.
Then you have not made it sound easy, and it definitely is a lot of hard work. You know, California, ground zero for America's housing affordability crisis, but not as much of an outlier any longer. Of nearly 400 metro areas in the country, according to NHC's Paycheck to Paycheck database, a registered nurse can only afford to own a home in 90 of them. And for teachers, middle school teachers, it's about 122. So that's really a change. I mean, everybody has always thought about this in the context of bicoastal communities, but more and more people are being hammered by this affordable housing crisis. You have a lot of deep experience in this, and I think you raised a really important point, which is the scalability issue, and that Eden can't do it alone. We wouldn't want it to. We want to be able to really leverage what you do. And so tell me a little bit about some of the things you've learned that really work, that we're like, yeah, more people should be doing this way.
Yeah, and I think when you think about housing solutions, there's no one solution. There's not a magic wand. If we just do this one thing, we're going to solve the problem. I would say if there was one thing we were going to do, it would be to produce more housing generally across the country, right? Production really is the way you manage the supply crisis that all of us are facing. I think, California, we're home to 39 million people. We have the largest homeless problem in the country, but a lot of that is because we have not built enough housing. And I think the other communities that are facing similar challenges, we just haven't produced enough housing. And so there's a lot of solutions within production that we have to think about, right? How do you make it easier to build the housing? How do you make it faster to build the housing? And how do you make it more cost effective to build the housing? And so if you just think there on production, what we like to think about when we're working with local communities is like, where there's a will, there's a way, right? If you really want to build the housing, you have to vote yes for the housing at the local level. And if you really want that housing to be affordable, you have to invest in the cost differential to make sure that housing comes out on the other side as affordable. The challenge that we have is a lot of housing is zoned for single family. It's not zoned for multifamily. We haven't zoned to densify. And so when you think about solutions, it starts with how can you build more quickly? And those solutions on the small end are things like accessory dwelling units or building townhomes that are more compact than a regular single family home on a half-acre lot. And so you're starting to think about, okay, how we zone for it, how we plan for it, how we vote yes for it, and how we build it. And so when you put that all together, I think what we've learned a lot in California is that you can't wish for more housing to happen and leave it all in the hands of a jurisdiction whose boundaries, are 5 square miles, for example. If you really want that jurisdiction to build housing, you have to create an atmosphere where they are encouraged to build housing, both carrots and sticks, but some structure where the state is saying housing is a priority. It's a priority for our economic development, and we are going to work with our cities to make sure that they actually plan for housing and build housing and have some accountability. This is a challenge that's epic, but until a few years ago, the state really didn't enforce whether or not the cities in California built the housing. So I think some of the things we've looked at here are how do you create a universe where you ask the cities to plan for the housing and then you encourage them to build it by holding them accountable to their planning documents.
And how do you create that? Because I know you've been a real vocal advocate in California, and I do think the governor there, Governor Newsom, has made some strides in this space. How's that going?
Well, we have passed a record number of streamlining bills since 2016, starting with Jerry Brown and now moving on to Governor Newsom, including allowing the Attorney General to enforce our housing planning law, which is called Housing Element Law. And I think it's been getting people's attention in a good way. We had one small community decide that the mountain lion crisis would prevent them from meeting the housing needs of the community. And the Attorney General sent them a letter and said, no, that's not really going to work. And they, of course, reconsidered their thinking. And, in the extreme, the Attorney General has actually brought suit against a jurisdiction to encourage them to be in compliance with their housing element law. And in fact, the Attorney General won the first round of that discussion. So the cities are now really focused on the fact that the state is paying attention. But that's not all the state has done. They are themselves taking an inventory of all the land that the state owns, and they are putting that out as surplus land for development. We have a requirement in California now that any publicly owned land has to go through an analysis to see if it can be housing. And if it can be housing under the Surplus Land Act, a certain percentage of that has to be affordable. And the cities are putting that out to bid with an encouragement to have a higher percentage of affordability. There have been some very high-profile sites like the arena in San Diego, the sports arena, that have had to recall their original RFP and have a do-over so that they encourage affordable housing being built. So I think the state's thinking about all of that, but also thinking about what are the incentives that we can give cities. We have a pro-housing designation in California where the cities get special advantageous treatment when it comes to certain kinds of funding in the state, so that if you get a pro-housing designation, you actually are able to get resources that you might not otherwise get if you're not pro-housing. And I would say this, most of the cities that we work with at Eden, they want to build housing. They want to build it. They're interested in doing it. And the ones who've been most successful have used California planning law to create kind of area-wide specific plans. So they say, oh, well, we want to intensify our downtown and we want to make sure we have housing. So they do a whole plan for a 20-block area. And in that plan, they pre-zone. So that when an Eden comes in to buy a site or is working in concert with a for-profit developer, the zoning part's done. So we don't have to go in and make a lot of huge changes, and all the environmental work is done at that juncture.
Wow, that's a game changer.
Oh, yeah, huge. I mean, the other thing that California has is we have a really epic environmental law called the California Environmental Quality Act. CEQA is its nickname. And CEQA has become a tool that a lot of people use to hold housing up. Yep. It was originally intended to protect the environment, but anybody can sue you under a CEQA approval for anything. And you still have to go to court. And if you're in Eden, you have to go to court and you have to defend yourself. And that's very expensive. We've now had, in the last few years, three such situations. And it's, lawyers are not inexpensive. And if you really don't want a project to be built, you can spend a lot of time holding a project up in court. The current suit that we're working on right now is in its third year. And it's been very expensive for us over the course of 3 years. 3 years ago, the project, had we been able to proceed, would have borrowed $16 million. And this year, because of interest rates, we can only borrow 9.7. So somebody's got to find that missing chunk of cash so that we can build that housing. And so we have to go out and look for extra resources. So if you really want to hold something up in California, death by delay is a good strategy under CEQA. So we've created some exemptions for certain kinds of housing so that you don't have to go through that process anymore. And we're just starting to see the fruits of those laws. So that's exciting.
Yeah, I mean, I often say that exclusionary housing policies are the last bastion of bipartisanship in America. We see them in red communities as well as blue ones, and sometimes even more in blue ones. And as you know, in the Bay Area in particular, this is a huge problem. But, when it comes to NIMBYism, if you don't want affordable housing in your backyard, you're going to end up with homeless people in your front yard. And people have to recognize that it's in their interest to deal with this.
But, it's interesting. In San Jose, which has done a really good job of working on large-scale specific planning, we're actually building 150 units for half of which will be set aside for people who are formerly homeless. And we went to meet with the neighbors as part of our planning process, community hearing process, and they were so excited that we were going to build this housing because they've been living with encampments in their neighborhood. And they asked us if we could literally move the folks that were living in the encampment nearby directly into our housing. And while the system doesn't quite work like that, I think for some folks who are living in the bigger cities, people like me, I would much rather see Oakland trying to come up with good strategies to build housing like the one I saw in San Jose. I think a lot of people are really coming to the realization that we have a huge problem that we have to solve. And I think there's this challenge right now between interim solutions, tiny homes and all these other really good sort of quick build solutions, and the need to have a place for people to navigate to from the tiny home. And so I think when we think of housing at Eden, we always think of the continuum. In the perfect world, life would be like it was for my parents. You'd rent an apartment that you could afford. You'd never be homeless. You rent an apartment you could afford. You'd graduate from that apartment you could afford to maybe something a little nicer. And then when you're really lucky and you saved enough money, you'd get to buy a house. And I think for so many people in this country, that continuum just doesn't exist anymore. Folks are super excited to get an apartment in the first place that they can afford. And then they don't really have a lot of options after that. And so I think the challenge is, how do we create a better housing continuum? And I think one of the interesting things coming out of COVID is a lot of people have moved to a lot of different places. And I keep reading articles about how people don't want the Californians to come, right?
Well, you have too much money when you sell your house. It definitely has an impact. It's not personal.
Yeah, but there's also this California effect, right? You have Amazon and all these other big tech companies going to places that aren't California now. And so they're going to, are they in Nashville?
They sure are, yeah.
DC metro area. They're in places that have never experienced what happens when you have this massive economic generator that brings a bunch of jobs all at once to your community, and you don't have enough place for the folks to live. And I think that puts a lot of pressure on your existing housing stock, puts a lot of pressure on your home ownership stock. And then you've got the other phenomenon of Airbnb. So if you're, lucky enough to be a tourist destination, then you have a lot of housing that's just, it's there for temporary renters. Ironically, I was just reading about Florence, Italy, which is having this same problem, that the effect of all these changes on the housing systems, from the economic growth to this sort of new kind of temporary living, without a lot of production to go with it, you have huge pressure on your existing stock.
There's actually interesting program in Vail, Colorado, called Vail Indeed, where they give you a lot of down payment assistance to buy a home, but it requires that you sell it through a deed restriction to another owner-occupant. It can't just sit empty because somebody bought it as a ski chalet and they're there 3 weeks a year. It can't be an Airbnb. It's going to be used as for owner occupancy, and that's it. That's the deed restriction. You just have to sell it to somebody else who's also going to live in it. And I think that's, the kind of creative thing we need to be doing more of. But you mentioned Nashville, and I was there recently, and it was really shocking to me when you stand up on. It was a rooftop, restaurant, and you look around. I counted over 20 construction cranes. And these jobs are great. We want more jobs in our communities. But if we don't build housing for these folks, then we've created a huge crisis. And the benefits of the new jobs are going to be eliminated by all of the inflation you end up having. You look at Phoenix, Arizona, least affordable rental, or actually I think the statistic was that it was when the biggest increase in rents was in Phoenix of the entire country. In the same year, that Phoenix also led the country in homelessness. And they're so closely tied, right?
It's a huge challenge, right? I mean, we all want the job generators. I'm not at all. I don't want anybody to construe me as being anti-job growth. I think job growth is super important to every community, that we need to have really good, well-paid jobs so that folks have a place to go to work. But I also think you have to balance your job growth with housing. In California, part of the problem we have is the tax incentives for building jobs is much better than the tax incentives for building housing. And so our tax incentives, sales tax is a huge local revenue generator. So no one wants to give up on sales tax from Apple, because there's a lot of iPhones being sold. But at the same time, all those folks who work in a building the size of the Pentagon, which is Apple's headquarters, they need a place to live. And so, you have to be able to plan for both of those. But the way our residual tax works, the local tax from Prop 13 is frozen. So it's really hard to make any money.
So for people who don't understand it, because this is such a big deal in California, and I think you are about a fifth of our economy. So tell me about this Prop 13 and what is going on there in terms of your state taxes.
So Prop 13 was a ballot initiative that passed way before I got here, but that basically froze property taxes at a specific percentage. And so my neighbors, for example, are a good example. They bought their house for $19,000, and they are taxed today at 1.25% of $19,000 in Oakland, California, where the median home value in the neighborhood now is probably $800,000 or $900,000. And so the cities, for all of that housing that's been held, and even on new housing, the cap is 1.25%. And so you don't make
on the original value. They're not even reassessing it.
On the original sale, and it goes up periodically, but not by a whole lot. It's capped by how much it can be raised, and so you have this interesting phenomenon now at all the local governments. If they want to build a library or get a new park, they have to find a way to pay for it. So the single best way to do that is either to issue general obligation bonds and assess every parcel by a certain dollar amount, or change the sales tax. And the sales taxes are capped, but we have pretty high sales taxes here in California. So you see a lot of quarter-cent sales tax initiatives at the county level to pay for transportation and infrastructure kinds of things. And so sales tax is the one revenue generator that you can actually control at the local level. And it's just really skewed. So if sales tax is your biggest revenue generator, you love Walmart, you love IKEA, and you love any of these tech companies that sell stuff. Me, just little Miss Homeowner, you don't love me so much. I mean, the good news for us in the affordable space is affordable housing with residents below 80% of median income. We're tax exempt on the base property tax, but we do pay any special assessments. So parks, mosquitoes, fire abatement, we pay for all of that, but we don't pay the base assessment on the property tax, which is kind of a gift for affordable housing, and one that we really need so that we can make the operating costs reasonable and keep the rents low.
And what about impact fees? Because that's been a big issue.
Well, impact fees vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, and we've had several bills to try to rein them in. And so the challenge with impact fees is when you're building something new, you pay for all of these costs to mitigate the impacts of your specific development. And so if you're a big home builder, for example, and building 2,000 units, you would be paying school fees, park fees, art fees, sewer fees, water fees, and those fees are set really. There's a whole nexus study that's done to figure out how to set those fees, but they are on the low end they're about $40,000 or $50,000 for a new unit. On the high end, they can be close to $200,000 a unit. So
per unit.
Per unit. So
that's going to have an impact on costs.
Well, yeah. I mean, if you're spending $1 million an acre to buy your land, which is pretty much what it costs here in California in most jurisdictions, and then you're spending $200,000 a unit, you're coming out of the grounds having spent $300,000 a unit, and maybe more depending on where you're working. And
you haven't bought a nail yet.
Yeah, I mean, no, you build nothing, not a stick,
right.
Not a brick, nothing. So yeah, so it's a bit of a conundrum. Let's put it that way.
Yes, that's a polite way of saying it. And so what, you're building a 100-unit building, say, or affordable multifamily in Oakland, California. What are you getting assessed for impact fees? Is it different for nonprofits?
So it depends on the jurisdiction. A lot of the jurisdictions will waive. Obviously, because we're 100% affordable, we don't have to pay the affordable housing fee. Mm-hmm. So usually we don't pay that. If we're doing senior housing and not family housing, we get a lower school fee. So we don't have to pay full boat on school fees because we won't be housing children. And I've done this survey. We own more than 2,000 units of senior housing, and I think we have like 110 kids living in them. Sometimes we have a grandchild living with a grandmother. So that's the only, or we have a manager who lives there who has a couple of kids. So it's really very low numbers of children in senior housing. So those are waived for seniors. And then some jurisdictions waive or discount the fees, or some of them will help subsidize our payment of the fees. So we're not exempt 100% from those fees, unfortunately.
So you and I could nerd out on housing policy for hours, but you're really such an inspiration to so many people, and I want listeners to really get to know you a little bit. How did you end up in this space? And you grew up in the Boston area, I think, and now you're leading this major affordable housing company in California. How did Linda Mandolini end up here doing this?
Gosh, a little bit by accident, a little bit kind of this weird coincidence. I was born on November 22nd, 1963, which is the day that John F. Kennedy was assassinated. And so my birthday, unfortunately, has always been a kind of a retrospective, right? And when I was growing up, because I was born on that day, similarly to 9/11, there was always a kind of a review of the accomplishments of the president with his speeches, and that ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. I totally took that stuff to heart. Like when I was 9 years old, I dressed as a ballot box for Halloween, which somebody just tattoo nerd on my forehead.
Oh, I love that.
Yes. And so I knew I was going to do something. Like I always felt like it was I wanted to change the world somehow.
Yeah.
And so I was a political science major in college. Thought I was going to go to law school, and accidentally landed in an internship in Hartford, Connecticut, working on a paper on affordable housing and how to change the housing situation in Connecticut. I graduated from Wheaton in Massachusetts, so I went back to Wheaton for my senior year, and I got a job in the mayor's office in Boston. And I have not really ever looked back. And when I think about the work, my earliest work was in Roxbury and Dorchester in Boston, really looking at abandonment, vacancy. There was a lot of victimization, second mortgage victimization of folks who lived in that community. Right. And just thinking about the way you could have real impact on the ground with the big policies that were formed. Like, how does this stuff happen? Something happens in the systems that make it possible for some of the abandonment and disinvestment to happen. Beyond redlining, there's the way money flows, the way capital flows makes a big difference in how neighborhoods work, but also just the impact you can have on the ground. When I was 26, I helped change my first law in Dorchester. And I will never forget the experience because my then boss, Alice Lee, who ran Codman Square Neighborhood Development Corporation, I went into her one day and I said, well, we can't do what we want to do because the law wasn't written for this kind of building. And she said, well, let's just see if we can change that law. And I happened to, no coincidence, work in a 2 Kennedy district at the time, Senator Kennedy and Congressman Kennedy. And they came out and they asked us how they could help us, and they actually changed the law for us. And so I learned kind of like you can have huge impact, right? I've always felt like I am changing the world, and I've chosen to do it in a way that I can do it one corner at a time. But I hope other people can look at what Eden has done and say, well, I want to change some of my corners just the way they have. And then, my policy work has really been focused on that. If we make the pie bigger for everybody, everywhere will have more housing. And a house is fundamental. Like, no kid that we work with can be successful without a house. You talk to a school teacher. I was in New Orleans for Thanksgiving, and I went on a turkey trot with a principal from Fort Lauderdale. And she talked about how she gave out her Thanksgiving dinners to all of these kids, and she had one family who couldn't take it because they were living in a rental truck. How does a child learn in that circumstance? And I think it's incumbent upon us to figure out a way to make sure that every kid has a roof over their head, that no one has to live on the street. And, I can't do everything all at once. So I've chosen to do my everything all at once in one state. But there's a lot of us out there. And I think when we work together, when groups like NHC really lead, and lead on the whole continuum, not just solving the homeless crisis, but recognizing that being a first-time home buyer, it's your route to wealth in this country to own a house. This is so important. So how do we create a system that works for everybody, not just for the super wealthy few?
And it is a continuum. We, see people who become home buyers, they build wealth. But if you can't afford to buy a home, you're going to be renting. That means more renters. More renters without the supply, rents go up. And at the bottom of that continuum, people are pushed into homelessness. And as you know, in California, we see this all over the country. There are people who are living in tents and cars. They go to a local washroom and wash up and go to work every day. And it's like, and it's just so, it's just unacceptable.
And if you ask any principal in any school district anywhere in the country how many kids they have in their school district that are homeless, they can tell you because they're counting. Even in some of the wealthiest cities and towns that Eden works in, there's hundreds of kids who are living in a car or couch surfing and in really unstable existences. And we just can do better. This country can do better. I'm sure of it. We have really good examples everywhere. Every community in this country has great examples of how they're trying to solve this problem.
Well, and, it's often heard, we're actually pretty successful in getting people out of homelessness. It's not easy, but the country gets, a couple 100,000 people out of homelessness in a good year. And yet we still have over 500,000 people who are homeless. And the reason is because we have a pipeline. And people are coming in and becoming homeless over and over again. And that's the challenge. If we can stop that pipeline, we can help people get out of homelessness. And then you've got the really hard group, right? The core, and that requires a lot. But you can stop people from going into that pipeline to begin with. And, not all of them start with mental health problems, but I can tell you, if I had to live, in a tent, it wouldn't take me long to have some serious mental health problems.
Well, I just think if you didn't have a consistent place to sleep, if you didn't know, I just think it's just so stressful. And, there's lots of literature out there. And I agree. I think the statistic, unfortunately, for California is for every one person we house, 2 more become homeless.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think an intervention that we have to do, and I think this is really a federal intervention, is really some more thinking about rental subsidy, or safety net subsidy. There's just lots of really good examples about how, one payment of $1,000 could keep somebody housed in that 1 month where they have a crisis where they can't pay their rent. And so how we create a better net to keep people housed, or if somebody is really on the brink, if there's, I think a lot of cities that we work with are really focused on rapid rehousing. How do you give people enough support to stay housed so that you're not dealing with having to deal with them once they become homeless, because it's actually more expensive for the cities. Once someone becomes homeless, you're spending money on emergency rooms and police and fire. That becomes your safety net, and that's not a great solution either. I think, I'm sitting here talking to you in the city of Hayward, and they've done an amazing job. They've actually reduced their homeless numbers, and they started a navigation center. They built.
What is that? Tell me about that.
It's a building built out of prefabricated structures, and it's basically like a small dormitory. But they worked with a service provider, and they bring people in voluntarily off the street. They live in the navigation center for a few months, and they navigate them to housing with the help of housing subsidy, the help of a counselor, and they move them into a permanent place to live. And you hardly ever go to an event where a mayor says, wow, we've reduced our homeless problem. I was just at a meeting in Marin County, which also has a homeless challenge, where they were talking about how they've actually reduced veterans housing homelessness by 80%.
Wow. And I know veterans homelessness is an area. Yes.
What?
Veterans homelessness is an area where we've made a lot of progress, I think.
But why can't we just replicate what we're doing there? Like, this is the question I ask of the federal government, because really, if you can solve it for vets, we can solve it for everyone.
Question. Yeah. It's a matter of political will. And of course, in the federal government right now, I think Congress is pretty much incapable of naming a post office, yet alone taking on serious reform.
It is sad to see the dysfunction, because I feel like there's a lot of unseriousness in a time where we need serious people, and I feel strongly that we could solve the housing crisis if we really focus on investing in the right places. I think we've done a really good job with the tax credit. I think we've done an okay job with vouchers, but we need more. I think we can't just cut all the production programs and appropriations and expect that to be okay. And, California, kudos to Governor Newsom. He has made epic levels of investment in housing. During the pandemic, we did Project Roomkey, where we could buy hotels and motels or lease them and rent them to homeless folks. And then he started HomeKey, where we could actually go out and buy existing buildings and convert them. And we were exempt from the Environmental Quality Act.
Okay.
So we're building a project in San Rafael. That's an old office building that we're converting into permanent supportive housing. And And if anybody told me in that particular county, which is one of the most challenging places to get anything approved, that in under 24 months, we would go from thinking about an idea to executing on it and starting construction, I would have said they were crazy. But in fact, we will be open next year. Wow. And we're working, but it's all because there was an idea, there was an investment, and there was the political will to expedite. And I think when you have all of those things, you can make that happen. And I think the states need to invest and the feds need to invest and the locals need to make an investment. And I think if everybody works in concert, as you know, I live half my life in the regulatory realm trying to make the regulatory agreement from the state work with the regulatory agreement for the federal government and work with the whatever local regulations are foisted upon a project. And you think, if only we could streamline this and put it all together and move it all faster, it would be a lot easier. But I feel like we're really trying to make headway in California for the first time. I mean, the governor signed 60 bills last year. 60. That's a huge number of housing laws. I mean, some of them, someone asked me about one the other day. I said, that we got that done. I haven't even been able to keep up with all of them. There were so many last year.
That's impressive. So tell me about this conversion, because this is something the Biden administration has recently become hot on, and people talk about quite a bit. It really depends on the building. I mean, in District of Columbia, very difficult for us because we have so many buildings that are all side by side across the entire block. We have a lot of vacancy in commercial space, but that's going to be really hard to convert. But you're doing a conversion. Tell me how that's going and what makes it work.
Yeah, it's a small, old, not so glamorous, Class B-ish, we'll be generous to its class, office building that is not very big, so it doesn't have one of these huge footprints. And so this is one of two that we're working on. In both cases, we have to create interior light, right? So the challenge with these big floor plates is you have no way to put windows on interior units. And so you have to come up with a way to make these units livable. And so I think there is the possibility of doing some of this work. And I think some of the older buildings lend themselves more easily than some of the newer buildings. But I think we should try, right? I mean, it's a huge resource. And I think if you look at what happened after 9/11, there was a lot of financial incentive in New York to do this work. And if you give some developers some financial incentives to do this work, you will probably see results. And so I think it's a difficult architectural challenge. And so I think there's got to be a way to solve for this. In our case, we created interior light wells. So
how do you do that?
Create interior. So you're building atriums inside of the structure. So the demo, it's not super inexpensive. I'll just say that. It's probably slightly less expensive than building from the ground up, but at least you're not wasting the resources of tearing the building down. You're not creating trash. And you are using something that exists in place. And that's actually, for us, we passed the law 2 years ago, AB 2011, which allows for commercial conversion by right if you're building affordable housing. And that makes this really special because then we don't have to go through the whole environmental.
That's quite a game changer.
Extravaganza. So there's actually some incentives there. And if you talk to the big developers in San Francisco, and I'm on the board of ULI San Francisco, they just did a really good piece on...
Which is the Urban Land Institute.
Urban Land Institute in San Francisco. It's the San Francisco chapter. They did a really interesting piece on how to approach the challenge that we're seeing in downtowns, right? How to revitalize San Francisco and make it, kind of bring it back. And I'll tell you, I love San Francisco. It's an amazing city, and it ain't dead yet. So anybody who's writing its epitaph, I wouldn't go there quite so quickly. But I would say that if we don't get a handle on how we're going to convert some of that office space, it's going to be a challenge because I think, let's face it, I like working from home a couple of days a week. I don't know about you. I know you love the office, but, it's going to be really hard to get the employee base to come back 5 days a week. And so some of this is going to have to change. Some of these uses are going to have to change. And it's just an evolution for cities that we're going to have to figure out.
No, and I think that's right. We are back 3 days a week. I was thinking I work about 4, but I was thinking about having everybody work 4. And I realized, what am I getting other than having them sit in a car for an extra 2 hours a week? Because I know they're working. So it's really changed, the way all of us think about a workforce. But at the same time, it's having a devastating impact on cities. I think 3 days a week is manageable, but a lot of places are less. And the federal government in particular here in Washington, D.C., the mayor is beside herself. And I don't know how you deal with that.
Well, it's really challenging. And I think it's the impact on small businesses, right? The restaurants that serve, the office workers, all of that. We just need to get people back. And I think the ULI study really concluded you need to get people back in downtowns to do things who live here. Right. So, how do I go to downtown San Francisco? How do you go into DC? I mean, you already live there, but how do you go into the district and do things? And how do we change the way we think about how we're activating the public spaces in these communities? And I think it ain't going to be easy, and it's probably not going to be as quick as we would want it to be. And even with companies mandating their workers coming back, I think it's a big employee retention issue for companies. If they say 5 days a week, I think they're going to lose people.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, they do. And they do. I want to close this out with something inspirational from you. When you look at your career, there's always a couple of those things that stand out that, are just create so much pride. That, I had this impact in somebody's life. But when you think about your career and all the work that you've done, give me an example of one of those projects that just was like, wow, am I part of that?
Maybe not so much a project example as a person example. Yeah. I started at Eden in 1996 when I moved here because my husband got a job in California, and it was kind of crazy to come to a market like this that's so expensive. But the first Eden housing event I went to was the opening of a project that we did in San Jose called Eden Palms Apartments. And it's this really lovely apartment community. And I met a family there, the Nguyen family, who had immigrated to the United States from Vietnam. And I got to know all of their kids through all the programs that we run, from after school to our demonstration technology programs. And then we did some even bigger technology programs, and we hired their oldest son to be an intern for us. And we run a little scholarship program at Eden, and Cy, their oldest son, got a scholarship from us, as did his brother Bill, as did their youngest brother. And I'll never forget the day that Cy graduated from medical school. His mom put the picture up on Facebook, and I felt like I had a small part in that. And, I come from an immigrant family. My dad moved here from Italy when he was 13. And I see this every day, how fundamental an investment in community housing and families, how much that investment in people can make a huge difference in their outcomes and their trajectory. And, I know that Cy's parents had a huge hand in him going to University of California and going to Drexel Medical School, but I know that his having a home that his family could afford so that he could stay in the same school system and go to after-school programs at our property and learn technology and keep up with the wealthy kids made a huge difference. And so for me, when I think about what we do, I think about that family and all the other families that, for whom having a house is so fundamental.
It is fundamental. It's foundational. It is the American dream.
It is.
And there you have it. You can end on that meaningful cliche. Thank you so much for joining us. I always appreciate it.
Cliche, David.
Absolutely. And I just really appreciate you and you joining us. And I always learn something, and today is no exception.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. And I really appreciate all the work that NHC is doing for all of us all over the country.
Well, you're very welcome. Thank you for listening to this edition of Beyond Four Walls. You can visit the National Housing Conference at nhc.org. There you can learn more about affordable housing policies, affordability challenges throughout the nation on our Paycheck to Paycheck database, and explore membership in NHC for you or your organization. We appreciate your interest and look forward to working with you in the future. Until next time, I'm David Dworkin, NHC's President and CEO, wishing you a great day.